March 1940. In a quiet office in London, a group of British accountants sat hunched over their ledgers, doing a piece of arithmetic more terrifying than any German bomb. They were calculating exactly how many months their nation had left before it starved, and the numbers were not survivable. Out in the cold, gray Atlantic, German U-boats were dragging 300,000 tons of merchant shipping to the bottom every single month, and the Royal Navy had only 200 escort vessels to guard convoy routes stretching thousands of miles across the most hostile water on Earth. Britain was losing ships faster than it could ever replace them, and at that rate the most powerful empire in the world would run out of food before it ran out of soldiers. Winston Churchill, barely 2 months into his post at the Admiralty, scrawled out a memo that tore through centuries of naval tradition. "We need hulls," he wrote, "not perfect ships. Hulls in the water now." And that single demand exposed an impossible problem, because the obvious answer was sitting in every British shipyard, and it was the one answer Britain could not afford. The destroyer was everything the Royal Navy knew about how to win at sea. 36 knots of speed, a battery of powerful guns, banks of torpedo tubes capable of taking on enemy battleships. The pride of the fleet. They were also financial suicide. Each destroyer swallowed 200,000 pounds and demanded 18 months of specialized labor from one of only 7 shipyards in the country capable of building them. At maximum effort, Britain could produce maybe 30 a year, while in the Atlantic merchant ships full of food and fuel were vanishing faster than that. Every week. The sums did not. Building the perfect warship was the surest possible way to lose the war. By May 1940, the situation went from desperate to catastrophic. France was collapsing. The U-boat threat was exploding, and it was at that exact moment, with the walls closing in, that a naval architect named William Reed walked into an Admiralty meeting carrying blueprints that made the officers wince. Because what Reed was proposing was not a warship at all. Reed had spent the 1930s designing something the Royal Navy considered beneath contempt: whaling ships. Slow, stubby, ugly commercial vessels built to survive the brutal seas of the Antarctic, thrown together from ordinary off-the-shelf steel, using techniques any small coastal shipyard already understood. They were cramped and graceless, with not 1 ounce of military glamour. But they cost £20,000 each, and could be built in just 8 months. And that difference, 10 times cheaper, was not an accounting detail. It was a revolution in disguise. Because here was the arithmetic that changed everything. For the price of 1 destroyer, Britain could put 10 of these little ships to sea. In the 18 months it took to build 3 destroyers, the same yards could launch 20 whalers. Reed had rewritten the whole question. The Royal Navy had been asking how to build the perfect submarine killer. Reed was asking something far more dangerous to the enemy. How do we flood the Atlantic with so many ships the U-boats cannot avoid them? The director of anti-submarine warfare understood it instantly. The Royal Navy did not need floating superweapons. It needed presence. Constant, overwhelming, inescapable presence, layer upon layer of ships, denying the U-boats any safe angle of attack. A destroyer was a scalpel, deadly in single combat. But the Atlantic did not need a scalpel. It needed a sledgehammer. And so, on July 25, 1940, while the Battle of Britain raged in the skies overhead, the Admiralty quietly placed an order that would help decide the war. 58 of these little ships, named the Flower class after garden plants, Gladiolus, Bluebell, Campanula, an almost mocking admission of how humble they were. The traditionalists were furious. Certain Britain was throwing away excellence for cheapness, and on paper they had a point. These corvettes could barely manage 16 knots, half a destroyer's speed. They carried a single gun where a destroyer carried a battery. Their entire anti-submarine arsenal was depth charges rolled off the back of the ship by hand. None of that mattered, because the only alternative to these ugly little ships was empty ocean and defenseless merchant crews burning to death in the freezing Atlantic night. By September 1940, as monthly shipping losses clawed toward a staggering 450,000 tons, the very first corvette completed her trials. She looked nothing like a proper warship. But that strange little converted whaler was about to do something the magnificent, expensive destroyers never could. She was going to help save Britain. And on the other side of the ocean, a German admiral had already perfected the exact tactic designed to make sure she never got the chance. His name was Karl Dönitz, and he had been refining his masterpiece since 1936. For centuries, submarine warfare had treated every boat as a lone hunter. Dönitz tore that idea up and invented the wolf pack. One U-boat would find a convoy and shadow it, radioing its position back while its sister boats raced to converge from every direction. And when 6 or 8 submarines had quietly surrounded their prey, they struck all at once, from every bearing at the same time, swamping the handful of escorts in pure chaos. The brutality of it was mathematical. A single destroyer could chase down one U-boat, maybe a second if it was lucky. But 6 U-boats attacking from 6 directions meant one escort spent the whole battle sprinting uselessly from threat to threat while merchant ships exploded, and men drowned in burning oil around it. There was no way to be in 6 places at once. On the night of October 18, 1940, a convoy of 43 merchant ships learned exactly what that meant. Guarded by just 2 escorts, they were found by a wolf pack south of Iceland. By dawn, 21 ships were gone, half the convoy, burning, in a single night. Dönitz's whole strategy rested on one unbreakable truth, that the escorts would always be outnumbered. Churchill saw the geometry of it perfectly, and it frightened him more than anything else in the war. He gave the struggle a name that would echo through history: the Battle of the Atlantic. It was, he later admitted, the only campaign that ever truly terrified him. Britain imported 55 million tons of supplies a year. Cut that lifeline, and every gun, every plane, every soldier became meaningless, because the nation would starve or surrender within months. Dönitz did not need to invade Britain. He only needed to sink enough ships, and he was winning. But the German admiral's entire doctrine rested on one fragile assumption, that there would never be enough escorts. His wolf packs devoured convoys precisely because the escorts were always too few. So what would happen to all that murderous mathematics if a convoy suddenly sailed, guarded not by 2 escorts, but by 8, 10, 12? What happened when the cheap little converted whalers started arriving by the hundred? The arithmetic that had been killing Britain was about to flip completely upside down, and the U-boat crews who called this their happy time had no idea what was coming. The answer began arriving, slowly at first, then in a flood. Between October 1940 and March 1941, 30 corvettes entered service, and at first the monthly losses actually got worse, the so-called happy time for the U-boat crews. But underneath the headlines, the trend line was quietly bending. Every new corvette narrowed the gap. And then a wolf pack closed in on a convoy and found not 2 escorts waiting, but 9 corvettes formed into a protective ring around the merchant ships. When the U-boats tried to coordinate their surface attacks, the corvettes were everywhere, forcing the submarines to dive, and once underwater a U-boat lost its speed, and its coordination collapsed. The pack scattered into the night. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. What was happening was nothing less than a revolution in how wars at sea were won. For centuries, British naval doctrine had worshipped one principle: build a better ship and beat the enemy in single combat. The corvette threw that worship in the bin. Build adequate ships in overwhelming numbers, it said, and win through sheer saturation. It was profoundly un-British, cold and industrial in its logic, and the senior officers despised it. One admiral sneered that the early corvettes were scarcely fit for purpose, and taken one at a time, he was right. They were slow, ugly, and outgunned. But that was the whole point. They were never meant to fight one at a time. Collectively, they were becoming unstoppable, and by May 1941, 89 corvettes prowled the Atlantic, and the average convoy escort had tripled in strength. The cheap little fishing boats were hunting back. And here is the part that made it possible. The part the Germans never fully grasped. The corvette was deliberately designed to be primitive. The blueprints showed a vessel barely 200 feet long, its dimensions lifted almost directly from the whaling ships. and the Admiralty's specification was intentionally crude in every single detail. Old-fashioned reciprocating steam engines instead of modern turbines, riveted construction instead of welded, a single propeller. Every one of those choices served one ruthless goal, that any shipyard in Britain could build these things using skills it already had. This was the masterstroke. A destroyer needed a specialized yard with heavy slipways, precision engineering workshops, and a workforce trained to exacting naval standards, and only 7 yards in the entire country could do it. A corvette needed none of that. Small commercial yards that had spent their whole existence knocking out coastal freighters and fishing trawlers suddenly received contracts. The design called for commercial-grade steel, standard merchant rivets, components already rolling off production lines by the thousand. Reed later admitted he had deliberately dumbed the design down so that yard-building fishing boats could switch over to building warships within weeks. The engine choice told the whole story. A destroyer's spectacular geared turbines generated 40,000 horsepower and needed specialist foundries and 9 months to manufacture. The corvette got a triple expansion reciprocating engine that was essentially Victorian technology, a scaled-up version of the machinery that drove railway locomotives, and Britain churned these out by the hundred for merchant ships and tugboats. They were sitting on warehouse shelves, ready to be bolted straight in, while destroyer building demanded the rarest skilled labor in the nation. Corvettes were built by riveters working in 4-man teams, heating rivets cherry red and hammering them home with techniques unchanged since Victorian times, slow and noisy and crude, but methods their workforce already knew in its bones. The speed of it was staggering. 1 yard laid a corvette's keel in November 1940 and had her completing sea trials just under 7 months later. Compare that to a destroyer of the era, which needed precision-matched turbine parts from 3 separate factories and custom fire control gear built to 1/1000th of an inch, and took 21 months and 300,000 man-hours of the most highly skilled labor in Britain to finish. That destroyer was undeniably superior in every measurable category. She was also just one ship. In the same 21 months, British yards completed dozens of corvettes, using the same labor hours spread across far less skilled workers. 1 yard alone eventually built 42 corvettes, launching a new one every 17 days at peak production. The Admiralty had made a conscious, terrifying bet, sacrificing perfection for sheer volume, gambling Britain's very survival on whether quantity could outweigh quality. But that bet came with a brutal hidden cost, and the men who paid it learned why the veteran crews called these vessels the ships that were halfway to hell. Out in a routine Atlantic gale, a corvette would roll 40 degrees to one side, hang there sickeningly, then crash 40 degrees to the other, completing that violent cycle every 8 seconds. And this was not a storm. This was just an ordinary Tuesday morning in the kind of weather the North Atlantic produced 3 days out of every week. 2/3 of a crew would spend an entire watch vomiting. The other third had simply stopped being able to eat at all. The rolling came straight from the design. Adapted from whaling ships, the corvettes were short and round, with a stubby hull that made them almost impossible to sink through weather, incredibly seaworthy. But that same shape made them roll like a barrel in anything above a flat calm. A destroyer sliced cleanly through the waves. A corvette rode up and over every single one, corkscrewing through every axis at once. And the living conditions made it a nightmare. A corvette built to house 47 men, routinely crammed in 85. When the swells climbed past 15 feet, seawater poured in through the ventilation shafts. Clothing never dried. Mold grew on everything. Men developed saltwater boils from sodden wool uniforms grinding against their skin for weeks on end. The cold was relentless. The ships had almost no proper heating, and the small coal stoves were banned during U-boat alerts because the smoke gave away their position. Men stood 4-hour watches in near-freezing winter temperatures, and frostbite was simply routine. And then there was the cruelest problem of all. A corvette's engine pushed it to 16 knots at absolute best, 12 in a typical swell. A surfaced U-boat could make 17. That meant a corvette could never actually catch a submarine running on the surface. Commanders watched in helpless fury as U-boats shadowed their convoys just beyond reach, their little ships plodding along, unable to give chase, crews exhausted and soaked and frozen to the bone. And yet, somehow, these miserable, despised, half-drowned little ships were about to start sinking the pride of the German submarine fleet. The first proof came in March 1941. The very first corvette, the one sailors had not known whether to laugh at or weep over, picked up a contact on her sonar at 1,400 yards. The submarine she was stalking was no ordinary boat. It was commanded by the most celebrated U-boat ace in all of Germany, the man who had famously slipped into the Royal Navy's own home anchorage and sunk a battleship at her moorings. He was a national hero, a legend. The little corvette closed in through heavy seas and rolled 14 depth charges off her stern in a diamond pattern. Deep below, the U-boat's hull crushed inward, taking the famous ace and his entire crew with it. Germany had lost one of its greatest heroes. Britain had spent a handful of depth charges that cost £8 each. And then, the kills started piling up. One corvette sank a U-boat in June. Another destroyed one in May. A third claimed one in October. By December 1941, these supposedly useless little ships had sunk 19 confirmed U-boats, more than every British destroyer in the fleet, combined over the same stretch. And the reason was not that the corvettes were better fighters. They were not. The reason was pure operational mathematics. Destroyers, complex and demanding, spent 60% of their time sitting in port for repairs. The corvettes, with their simple, almost indestructible Victorian engines, stayed at sea 70% of the time. More time at sea meant more encounters. More encounters meant more kills. The very crudeness everyone had mocked was exactly what made them deadly. The pattern of those kills became almost a ritual. A U-boat caught on the surface would crash dive the instant it spotted a corvette. And the moment it went under, it lost its speed advantage and crawled along at 7 knots. Now the corvette held the upper hand. It would quarter the area methodically, pinging away with sonar, forcing the submarine to stay down and burn through its precious battery power, until eventually the U-boat either surfaced straight into the corvette's gun or stayed submerged until the depth charges finally found it. One commander called it terrier tactics. "We could not outrun them," he said, "so we simply outstayed." It cost the corvettes dearly. These ships died too, often taking most of their crews down with them in minutes. 47 Flower-class corvettes were destroyed across the war, but Britain kept building replacements faster than the U-boats could ever sink them. When the Admiralty added up the final accounting after the war, the numbers were almost impossible to believe. The Flower-class corvettes had taken part in actions that destroyed 294 U-boats. No other class of Allied warship came close. The proud, expensive destroyers sank fewer, and the exchange rate was strategically decisive. Britain lost 47 corvettes worth a combined £940,000. And those little ships helped destroy German submarines worth around 16 million. But the money was the smaller half of it, because each U-boat also carried highly trained submariners, irreplaceable specialists, and Germany bled away 15,000 of them. The U-boat arm never recovered. The slow, humble corvette had strangled Germany's submarine fleet to death simply by being numerous enough and persistent enough that the superior German boats could no longer avoid them. And here is where the true genius of the decision finally reveals itself. In the one place nobody thinks to look, the national ledger. The entire corvette program cost around £10 million, less than 3% of Britain's total wartime naval spending. Now imagine the alternative. Suppose Britain had insisted on guarding its convoys with destroyers. Doing that properly would have demanded thousands of them, at a cost that would have run into the hundreds of millions, dozens of times what the corvettes cost. That staggering difference is money Britain simply did not have and could never have raised without bankrupting itself completely. That is what the corvette truly bought. Britain entered the war as the richest creditor nation on earth and came out of it as the largest debtor. Piling the cost of a destroyer fleet on top of that would have made the debt unsurvivable and might well have forced Britain into a compromised peace in 1943. exactly when the tide was turning. The savings from choosing the humble ship over the perfect one freed up enough industrial capacity and money to fund the very campaigns that won the war. And it worked. Monthly shipping losses peaked at a horrifying 768,000 tons in late 1940, the moment Dönitz nearly severed the Atlantic lifeline for good. But by May 1943, those losses had collapsed, while U-boat sinkings spiked so sharply that Dönitz pulled his wolf packs out of the Atlantic entirely, admitting he could no longer bear the losses. By that summer, the corvettes outnumbered the destroyers in service 2-1, and no convoy ever again sailed without a powerful escort. The U-boats now faced overlapping sonar screens and coordinated escort groups that outnumbered the very wolf packs that had once ruled the ocean. So, here is what should never be allowed to sink into silence. The corvette was the ship the experts laughed at, the converted whaler the admirals called scarcely fit for purpose. The crude little barrel that rolled its crews half to death and could not even catch a submarine on the surface. And it sank more U-boats than any other warship the Allies ever built, and it did it for 1/10 the price of a destroyer. Britain won the Battle of the Atlantic not by building the perfect weapon, but by building the good enough weapon in numbers the enemy could never overcome. The lesson is as old as war itself and as cold as the North Atlantic. A perfect ship that arrives too late and costs too much wins nothing. An adequate ship, built fast, built cheap, and built by the hundred, can save an entire nation. The German submariners had laughed at the little flowers. By the end, those little flowers had